To the fans across the globe, both past and present, and to the crew who brought the originals to life, we offer our profound and heartfelt thanks. That's a nice touch. I like that. And there it is. Roll credits, my friends. Final Fantasy III Pixel Remaster. Another Final Fantasy experience in the books. Supervised by none other than Yoshinori Kitase himself. Directed by Takahiro Noda. Okay, so you can really start to see, I mean, one of the most interesting things to me about going on this entire journey was just to really see the origins of this franchise and how things have progressed over time. The way that the games have evolved, and things are going to be very familiar and some things are going to be less familiar, and just seeing the genesis of this series has been really interesting to me. For better or worse, I mean, there's obviously, as we go back, you see things that are just like so much less polished or less in-depth or less high quality than they are in the later entries. But then you see some of the things like in their purest, like rawest, earliest forms, and you can really see the seeds of what went on to become some of the most defining things about the franchise. And especially with Final Fantasy 16 coming out, I know I usually talk about the game like immediately, but like the question of what is a Final Fantasy game, like what makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game, is getting talked about a lot. And there's obviously, it's a very I wouldn't say it's a very subjective question. I think there are definitely a lot of things that fans agree on, but there's certain aspects of it that divide fans a lot, and people have, of course, differing opinions on what is a quintessential Final Fantasy game. But to me, I've really felt like, especially from 3 through to 6, because they've all been of a similar sort of quality in terms of like the era that they were in, the 8-bit, 16-bit, I always forget like what it is technically, but basically this kind of era, the SNES and the NES visuals and that kind of thing, they all feel very consistent to me. And it goes beyond just the visuals. I mean, mechanically, yes, this one didn't have like an active, it didn't have an ATB system, it was more of like a turn-based system. But in general, like the menus, the way that you select the moves, and the way that the battles play out, it's not all that different from having a wait mode in like an ATB game. And like that kind of stuff is familiar to me. And the amount of like journeying that you do within the game, the different worlds that's presented to you, the different locales, and all of that kind of stuff, I feel like they're all very Final Fantasy things, and they've been established clearly from the start. And they found a formula that really started to work, and they rolled with it for a very long time. And to me, like, especially playing through 3 to 6, you've got to see how they've managed to sort of build upon each of the previous games. And even though every game wasn't necessarily better than the one before it, there was enough different about them, but also enough the same to make them feel like part of the same franchise. They all feel very cohesive to me. Like playing through 3 to 6, they flow really nicely together. And I think that's just a testament to how consistent they're able to keep the games while still making each one feel like individual and unique. And so, especially playing through this one, I mean, you can just see like the different types of worlds that we went into. So we had like, you know, the Tower of Owen that then took us through to the other world that was completely flooded. And then like the floating continent situation. And then when you look across again, like 3 to 6, you've got a lot of like lunar worlds. You've got different types of continents. You've got all of these different worlds meshed into like one series and this one franchise. And so to me, like the world is always one of the things that to me makes the Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game. It doesn't necessarily have to have different worlds or different continents within the game itself, but you could tell very early on that part of the experience that they wanted to have players go through was to have them truly journeying and exploring and finding new realms and new worlds, and having the environments change quite regularly as you play through the game. And so that to me is something that really has been established quite strongly, at least in 3 to 6, and we're going to see probably more of that in 1 and 2 as well. And so this game again, it impressed on that front. You've seen again the nice like clean remaster visuals as well. I think they look really good. I was actually impressed. Yeah, I've been playing like nice emulated versions, so I have gotten the benefit of using emulators for 4 to 6, and so they've always looked like crisp and clean and nice. But natively, I think they've done a really nice job. especially with this font. I really do like this font. This is like a fan-made font that they added later on, but I think it complements the style really well. And so the Pixel Remaster, I think in its approach was very good. They didn't try to do too much. They did keep it, of course, a very pure experience like it was in the originals. They did make some quality of life improvements that I think are definitely welcome for players who have never played these games before, especially. And so I have appreciated that kind of stuff. Some are like, the quick save ability and the inventory management not being as much of an issue. And I'm sure there's like many other things. You can auto battle and you can do a bunch of other things that you couldn't do previously. I don't think any of these are particularly game breaking or like they make the game too easy or anything. Probably the originals are more challenging, but not necessarily in like a high quality way, if that makes sense. And so in general, I'm impressed with what they've done with the Pixel Remasters. And of course, it's going to bring me to the music. Another staple of a Final Fantasy experience is that music. And you've seen once again, like Uematsu has just absolutely knocked it out of the park in this game. I mean, the consistency that he's shown throughout all of the Final Fantasies that he's worked on is just unbelievable. And once again, like, there's so many tracks that have been used. There's hundreds and hundreds of tracks that have been used across Final Fantasy. And somehow, like, they don't get stagnant, they don't get stale. He finds like a new inspiration and a new kind of way to approach the music every single time. And so it sounds familiar while sounding so special at the same time. And this game musically really blew me away. I still think it might just be the single most standout feature for me in the game. I really like the soundtrack, really did blow me away for the era, considering how early it was. So many brilliant tracks, and I was just super impressed. And so to me, that's like that's a Final Fantasy thing to me. It's just got to have a really good soundtrack. It's got to have it. And Uematsu, just the absolute godfather of establishing that. But a shout out does have to go to the producers and stuff that worked on arranging his work. And basically, I went onto Spotify and I got stuff like Eternal Wind, the original version. It definitely sounded different. I still loved it. But you could definitely tell that the versions for the Pixel Remaster, they have had work and love put into it. It wasn't like a kind of something that was so basic that they don't deserve any credit. It was a nice cohesive effort between, of course, the original genius of Uematsu and those that came after him in order to rearrange the tracks and bring us like a fresh take on the classics from Uematsu. So yeah, just absolutely wonderful work in general from Square Enix. And I've definitely seen some very lazy stuff from Square Enix. Like, I will never forgive the Final Fantasy VIII Remaster. I think that it's absolutely trash. And the fact that they even charge people full price, well, not full price, but like the fact that they charge people anything for that, that was super disappointing. It was basically, it should have just been a Steam version of Final Fantasy VIII that was just the same as the original. Like, the default version of Final Fantasy IX on Steam is just as much of a Steam remaster, is just as much of a remaster as the official Final Fantasy VIII remaster. So I've seen Square do it lazy, but with this one, I feel like the Pixel Remaster, my first taste of it, I would say they've done a genuinely good job, and it's been relatively high effort. Yeah, there are some weird stuff, like the fonts I think were very strange, and I don't like the original fonts that it released with, but they have made changes to that over time. And I think overall, when you look at it, they have done a really nice job of keeping the classic feel and soul of the games and genuinely just making it a fairly simple remaster, but adding in enough nice touches to really help it translate to the modern age, because this really didn't feel like a game that came out over 30 years ago at this stage. And of course, part of that is to do with the fact that I have been playing through 4 to 6, so I'm much more used to it. But I do genuinely feel like someone who's never played an old school Final Fantasy, but is a general fan of Final Fantasy and JRPGs, could definitely step back into the Pixel Remaster of Final Fantasy 3 and have a great time. I think it definitely holds up enough for that kind of thing. Now, Final Fantasy 2 and 1, we'll just have to see. Final Fantasy 1 will always get a pass because it is the original. But Final Fantasy 2, I don't know. I hear it's a very quirky game in terms of its like design and mechanics, and we're just going to have to find out. But 3, I think I can definitely recommend it. Is it as good as 4, 5, and 6? I would say no. As much as I have praised it so far, I would say that you can definitely tell that it is an older one. Even though it has a lot of the same feel, and a lot of the same, like, the visuals, the airships, the worlds, the style, the sprites, Some of like the story themes and dialogue, and you know, there's definitely a lot of recognizable things in it, but I would say that you could tell it was definitely like a smaller, more held back version of the experiences that were later going to arrive with Final Fantasy IV onwards. So we've got to the end of this first credits. Let me just see what it's going to do here, and I'll continue talking about it for a little longer before I wrap this series up. Let's see if this stays like indefinitely. If it does, I can just carry on through here. Yeah, I think if I don't press anything, I think it just stays, and that's cool. Okay, yeah, so I would say, as someone going backwards, it's something that I have to sort of put into perspective. I think, once again, the magic to me of these earlier Final Fantasies is they really do take me back to a time that I never really got to experience. It's very weird. Like, I play a game like this, and I almost feel as if I am kind of back in 1990, playing this game alongside everybody else back in the day. But I wasn't even born in 1990, let alone actually gaming back then. So it's a weird feeling, because it really does give you that sort of old school nostalgia and that feel. And I just can't help but imagine the amazing experiences that people would have had where you were a kid in like 1990, or an adult, or whatever your first kind of meeting with Final Fantasy III was. Well, in Japan, I guess, back in the day. But experiencing these games for the first time when they were fresh in that era, it must have been so magical, because these days especially, I feel like we've just got so many options, absolutely endless games. We're so spoiled in terms of like the choices that we have, the visuals that we have, everything. I mean, the gaming industry has had so much time to grow and evolve and mature and improve, that like back in 1990, a game like this, experiencing this for the first time, it just must have blown your mind. And when I play these like old school Final Fantasies, it really takes me back to those times that I never experienced, because I feel like I live it through the game in these like modern ages, and it's really interesting to me. And so Final Fantasy III Pixel Remaster has given me that feeling too, and it makes me wish I was born in like the early 80s, and I was like 9, 10, 11, 12 years old when like these games came out, and I got to play them when they were new for the first time, and just be absolutely blown away by them, because that's basically what I experienced with like Final Fantasy X. I caught like the tail end of that kind of era, but it must have been so special, because like you've played this one, you've had an amazing time, and you're just waiting for that next experience, and they were just cranking out consistently great games for that period of time. So I am jealous of the OG fans that got to play Final Fantasy from the start and just experience game after game after game. And so few of them, I would say, would have been letdowns for fans of the series. And so you guys had an incredible streak that kind of ended with Final Fantasy X/Final Fantasy XII, depending on how you look at it. And things have been very different since then. So being able to go back to an era where Square Enix, or Square, and Final Fantasy were so different, like in such a completely different stage of its lifespan, it's definitely super interesting. But as I've been saying, one of the detriments of that is that you really get to see like the kind of more primitive nature and the more restricted capabilities that they had with the game. I mean, it's a smaller, shorter game, but I would say that the general length of the game didn't bother me. The fact that it was basically about 20 hours, I thought that was totally fine. Could it have been longer? Yeah, sure, of course. Like 10 more hours of this game, I wouldn't have minded at all. Like a few more areas, a bit more expanded dungeons, or some other side questy options, of course, would have been great. But I think the shorter length really helped to keep it tight and to keep things moving. And so I think pacing-wise, it was a strong game. There was very little time spent doing relatively nothing, or like, I don't know, doing a dungeon that had 15 floors that was just repetitive over and over and over again. I felt like the game flowed quite well. And so the shorter length, I mean, we still had like multiple worlds and continents to visit. We had lots of different caves and towers and all of that kind of stuff too. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't quite like a tour de force like Final Fantasy VI was, but I definitely wasn't disappointed by the game being short. And so that's an aspect of the sort of limitation that didn't affect me too much. But I think the final boss battle was a really good example of where the game falters for me, as someone going backwards in the year 2023 and trying to experience these games like 30 years after they were released, 33 years later. And so the final boss was literally just spamming particle beam, just one move, and then just using a physical attack. I think he used it twice throughout the whole battle, and that was it. Like, that was the whole thing. And so clearly that's one of those things where I don't think it's just because the developers were so dumb that they thought, oh yeah, this move is so great that this is all we need for this boss. They probably just didn't have the ability to give this thing like 5 or 6 different moves, or all of these different like potential different options, animations, phase changes, whatever it might have been. And so the final boss was very lackluster, unfortunately. And it's probably one of the first times I've ever played a Final Fantasy where the final boss just felt like a complete meh. It looked very cool at the start, but the battle itself was definitely mediocre compared to the kind of stuff that you face later on in the franchise. And so that to me is like a very good demonstration of where this game kind of falls flat for me. And so you see it across the game anyway. With random encounters you don't notice it as much, but when the game needs to kind of up the ante in terms of gameplay, I don't think it has that extra gear. And so that's something I definitely missed from this game that I would have loved to have seen. I'm also not as big a fan of the whole like unnamed protagonist, and they try to make it obviously like you name the characters, they feel like they're your characters. You probably name one after yourself if you're playing it back in the day, and that's supposed to make you feel much more sort of involved in the story and literally a part of it. I'm personally not too big a fan of that. It didn't sort of personalize the characters enough, and it felt, when I say personalize, I meant more in terms of like, in terms of the story itself, they were very anonymous. So you could give them your name, but they didn't really have a proper backstory, or like, they were referred to in ways that were sort of general. No one was speaking as an individual. It was just like a general, it could have been any of them saying that particular line. And for me, that particular storytelling format, for a Final Fantasy game, I don't think it works as well. I personally don't like it as much. And so that was another area where definitely compared to like 4, 5, and 6, it was nowhere near as strong. And so that was something that I wish was different. And these are important elements. And so for that reason, I can't put this game up there with 4, 5, and 6, but I would say it's far from a mediocre game or like a poor game or anything like that. I'd still definitely put it in the good category because of that music, because of those clean visuals, because it still retains that Final Fantasy magic and that ambition with like all of these different airships and just like these towers and these different worlds and the flooded continent and all this kind of stuff. Like that kind of stuff still continues to capture me and interest me. And we had the turn-based battle system, which after playing all of these games was like nice to kind of go back to. It was one of the closest experiences to Final Fantasy X, I guess, in that sense, because it was a pure kind of turn-based system. And so that was nice. And there were definitely, and of course, just the general nostalgia factor of going back through the franchise is something that holds firm for me. So I think I'm going to close off with that. It was a good game, but definitely suffered a bit from its time and the resources that the developers had, I think, for this one. And so you could see that 4 was definitely quite a leap. Having played 3 now, 4 was definitely quite a leap. Now, what is interesting, this is something that I learned from Daryl from Final Fantasy Union, because those guys literally research Final Fantasy for a living. That's basically what they do, and they're incredibly good at it. But apparently, I said it quite a few times playing through the game, the job system was nice and I did enjoy that a lot, but it felt like a baby version of Final Fantasy V, which I think did it better. So this game really felt like the prequel to Final Fantasy V from a design standpoint. And so I chatted with Daryl one day, and he said to me that originally Final Fantasy V was meant to be Final Fantasy IV. And so that made a lot more sense, because if you can imagine the game after this one being the one that later became Final Fantasy V, then it starts to make more sense. It feels like a more natural kind of progression onto that one. But then later, things changed and they decided to create Final Fantasy IV, the one that did become Final Fantasy IV, and release that before Final Fantasy V instead. So there was a bit of a swap between like 4 and 5 in the franchise. And so that kind of made a lot of sense to me. But yeah, you can see the general leaps. Like compare this to Final Fantasy V and compare this to Final Fantasy IV. Whichever one you compare it to, you can see that they definitely took it up like a couple of notches in terms of the storytelling and in terms of like the depth of the gameplay and the enemy movesets and that kind of stuff too. And those are pretty important factors. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the series. I had a really good time playing this one, and I am looking forward to playing Final Fantasy II, but not for the reasons I should be, because people keep telling me that like it's going to be really fun watching you trying to play through Final Fantasy II, and I've pretty much only ever heard generally negative things about Final Fantasy 2, in that it has a very weird mechanic, like gameplay system. People have kind of locked themselves into particular sections they've not been able to get out because they've not been at the right kind of level. Just weird things. And deliberately, I've not done any research into the game. I'd love to approach it blind and just to kind of, if necessary, suffer through it, so that you guys can see what it's like for someone who has a blind run of the game. And is it truly as bad as people say it is? So coming in with limited expectations has historically worked well for me with Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy IX was the first time I went back before the PS2 era, and I was very nervous thinking, man, is this game going to be like too old and I'm not going to enjoy it because I'm so used to the voice acting and the visuals of PS2 that this is just going to be too primitive and I'm just going to leave it and really end up hating it. It was a resounding no. Then the same thing happened when I went back to Final Fantasy VI. So I was like, now we're going to like the Pixel era. Is this going to be a step too far back? 6 ended up being one of my favorites of all time. And so now I go back to Final Fantasy 3, and I'm like, people always say like the true Final Fantasy really hit its stride after Final Fantasy 4. 3, like it's never like quite at that level. So I wasn't expecting too much from 3. And then 3 kind of quietly surprised me with how good it was. And now 2, I hear like it's basically one of the worst of the franchise. For people that have played through all of them, especially like anything 10 and before, 2 seems to be one of the absolute worst of the bunch. And so I have very low expectations for that game. And so I'm hoping that I'm going to come out of it thinking I kind of don't get the hate for this game, or like the confusion about like its mechanics, or like why it's so bad or whatever. Chances are I probably won't say that. My experience will likely be the same as the majority, but having low expectations for 2 I think is going to be the best way forward. So for those of you guys that have been with me on this journey over the years going back through the Final Fantasy franchise, I of course appreciate it all so much. The fact that there's still so many of you here all these years later, still like, you know, 1,500 to 2,000 people watching per episode, in the longer term at least, that's really, really cool. And I'm hoping that you guys continue to stick around for Final Fantasy 2. But first, it's going to be an interesting phase as I play Final Fantasy 3 Pixel Remaster. Within a few weeks, I'm going to be playing Final Fantasy 16, which is going to be the newest and shiniest and most different Final Fantasy experience we've had in a long time. The first numbered mainline entry since 2016. And then I'm going to play that one, and then I'm going to go back to Final Fantasy 2. So yeah, expect that one after Final Fantasy 16. But it's going to be quite the wacky experience to play through 3, 16, and then 2 for the first time. So yeah, you have that to look forward to, my friends. So thank you all so much for watching. Really do appreciate the support, especially the peeps on Patreon and all of the channel members. You guys are huge, and you help me to continue to bring you guys these series for your fellow viewers to enjoy. So I'll sign off with that. Thank you for watching. Take care. I'll see you soon.